The air in the interview room at Denver Police Headquarters is stale, smelling of cold coffee and institutional floor wax. It is April 14, 2014, just past 11 p.m. Across from Detective Troy Bisgard sits a man who looks less like a murderer and more like a lost traveler. This is Richard Kirk. He is 47 years old, wearing an orange jacket, and his eyes are darting toward the corners of the room as if he's watching something no one else can see. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Is this just normal procedure? Richard asks, his voice trembling with a forced, childlike innocence. He isn't asking about the handcuffs or the blood on the floor back at his home on St. Paul Street. He's asking about the camera. He's asking if the detective is like Columbo. This is the edible defense in its rawest, most immediate form. For the next hour, Richard engages in a bizarre dance with the detective. He talks about Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints, and Common Core curriculum. He claims he doesn't know where he is. He says he can't trust himself. To the casual observer, this is a man in the throes of a psychotic break, a victim of Colorado's newly legalized recreational marijuana industry. But Detective Bisgard is a professional. He knows that the truth isn't found in what a suspect says, but in the gaps between their words. While Richard is playing the part of the confused mystic in the interrogation room, the crime scene back at the Observatory Park neighborhood tells a much more linear, violent story. Richard and Christine "Chris" Kirk had been married for 15 years. To the outside world, they were the quintessential Denver success story. A beautiful home in a prestigious neighborhood, 3 healthy young boys, and a deep involvement in their community. Chris was the heartbeat of the family, a Michigan native, a proud Wolverine, and a dedicated mother who lived for jumping on the trampoline with her sons. But the foundation of the Kirk home had been rotting for years. Beneath the maize and blue flags and the friendly waves to neighbors lay a dark history of Richard's mean streak. Long before the marijuana edible entered the picture, there were the red flags. There was the 1994 felony assault charge in Texas, a dark stain on his record from before the marriage. There was the 2000 DUI. And then there was the road rage. Family members would later testify that they refused to sit in the front seat with Richard. He was a man who felt disrespected by the world, a man who would tailgate and scream at strangers for the smallest perceived slight. By early 2014, the pressure in the Kirk household had reached a boiling point. Richard was battling chronic back pain and a growing addiction to hydrocodone. The physical pain was real, but the financial pain was worse. The family was drowning in $40,000 of credit card debt and owed a significant sum to the IRS. Richard's ability to work was dwindling, but his impulsivity was not. He had recently stolen his own Jeep for insurance money and spent a tax refund on an expensive motorcycle without telling Chris. Chris was done. She was a woman who had reached her wit's end. She told friends she was waiting for the perfect moment to tell Richard she no longer loved him. She had already taken the step of placing a hard cap on his spending, a move that wounded Richard's pride more than his wallet. On the afternoon of April 14th, Richard claims he was driving home from running errands when his back pain flared up. He saw a dispensary. He walked in, chatted with an employee for 19 minutes, and walked out with a pack of Karma Candy orange ginger gummies, 100 milligrams of THC. He claims he took a bite, felt nothing, and then ate more. Within the hour, he says, the world dissolved. He claims he stood outside his front door staring at his house number, unable to recognize his own life. He says that when he saw Chris, she was a stranger, an intruder. But as the clock ticked toward 9:30 p.m., Chris Kirk realized her husband wasn't just high, he was dangerous. She picked up the phone and dialed 911, her voice a fragile thread of terror. She told the dispatcher her husband had eaten a marijuana edible. She said he was talking about the end of the world. She begged them to hurry. As Chris spoke, her 3 young sons were upstairs, terrified, locking themselves in a room to escape their father's erratic behavior. Chris told the dispatcher there was a gun in the house, but it was locked in a safe. She thought she was safe. She thought the distance between the safe and the ammunition was her shield. She was wrong. As Chris pleads with the dispatcher, she hears a sound that freezes her blood. the distinct click of a gun safe being opened. She realizes that the man who claims he doesn't know who she is has just found exactly what he was looking for. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The 911 call from 2112 South St. Paul Street is one of the most haunting recordings in the history of Denver law enforcement. It lasted 13 minutes. For 13 minutes, Chris Kirk was the eyes and ears of the police, providing a real-time account of her own impending murder. "He's acting very, very weird," Chris whispers to the dispatcher. She describes Richard's hallucinations, his talk of the apocalypse, and his demand that she shoot him. But the most terrifying part of the call isn't what Richard is saying. It's what the police aren't doing. While Chris is pleading for help, a catastrophic failure is occurring within the Denver dispatch system. The dispatcher is entering notes into the CAD, computer-aided dispatch system, recording that a weapon is involved and that the situation is escalating. However, the dispatcher fails to relay these updates verbally over the radio. The officers racing toward the neighborhood are driving blind. They cannot read the screen while navigating through traffic. They believe they are heading to a routine domestic disturbance caused by a bad reaction to marijuana. They have no idea they are walking into a theater of execution. Back inside the house, the children are huddled together. The youngest is just 7 years old. They can hear their father's heavy footsteps. Richard isn't just wandering in a haze. He is methodical. He has retrieved the 9mm handgun. At the 12-minute mark of the call, the tone shifts from fear to pure, unadulterated horror. Chris screams. The sound of a single gunshot rips through the phone line. Then total silence. The first officer arrived at 9:47 p.m., a full 16 minutes after the call began. The police station was only 1.1 miles away. Had the dispatcher spoken the words, "He has a gun," over the radio, those officers might have arrived 4 minutes earlier. Those 4 minutes were the difference between life and death for Chris Kirk. When the police finally breached the door, they found a scene of domestic carnage. Chris was on the floor with a catastrophic wound to the head. She was gone. Richard was there, still in his haze, claiming he had killed his wife but seemingly unable to explain why. But it's what Richard did after the shot that reveals the true darkness of his mind. According to investigators, after he pulled the trigger, Richard didn't collapse in grief or wander out into the street. He walked into his 7-year-old son's bedroom. He looked his child in the eye and handed him the gun. He told the boy to kill him so that Mom and Dad could be together with God. The only reason the children survived that night was a mechanical fluke. When the boy didn't pull the trigger, Richard tried to use the weapon again, but the gun malfunctioned. It jammed. The end of the world Richard had been preaching about was restricted to that single fatal bullet. Richard was taken into custody without a fight. By the time he reached the station, the bad trip narrative was already in full swing. He told anyone who would listen that the edible had possessed him. He was a victim of the state's new laws. He was the poster child for the dangers of legal weed. However, as the sun rose the next morning, detectives began to look into Richard's activities earlier that day. They didn't just find a receipt for marijuana. Detectives pulled the security footage and bank records from earlier that afternoon, and what they saw destroyed the image of a man who accidentally lost his mind. Richard Kirk hadn't just prepared for a trip, he had prepared for a war. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The edible defense began to crumble the moment the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit started digging. If Richard Kirk was truly a victim of a sudden THC-induced psychosis, his life leading up to April 14th should have been normal. It wasn't. The investigation revealed that Richard had been planning a financial exit strategy for weeks. Just a month before the shooting, Richard did something highly unusual for a husband in a committed marriage. He changed his payroll direct deposit. For years, his paycheck had gone into a joint account he shared with Chris. Suddenly, it was being diverted into a private account Chris couldn't touch. At the same time, the couple was being crushed by debt. The $40,000 in credit card balances wasn't just numbers on a page. It was a constant source of verbal abuse and screaming matches, according to Chris's sister and friends. Chris had told her sister that Richard was holding onto his bonus pay and refusing to help with the bills. He was starving the household of funds while building his own private reserve. Then came the discovery of the life insurance. Chris Kirk was worth $340,000 dead. For a man facing IRS seizures and mounting debt, that payout wasn't just a safety net. It was a solution. But the most damning piece of evidence was found at a local sporting goods store. On the very same day Richard bought the marijuana ginger candy, just hours before the 911 call, he bought 9mm ammunition. This single fact changed everything. Why does a man who is casually stopping by a dispensary to treat back pain also need to stop and buy fresh bullets? The prosecution began to build a theory. Richard didn't eat the edible and then get the gun. Richard got the gun, bought the bullets, and then ate the edible to provide himself with the perfect alibi. He was using a bad trip as a legal get-out-of-jail-free card. The community was divided. Marijuana advocates feared the Kirk case would be used to roll back legalization. Anti-drug activists used Chris's death as a rallying cry against the unregulated industry. In the middle of this political firestorm was a dead mother and 3 orphan boys. The legal battle was set to be a landmark case. Richard pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense team prepared to argue involuntary intoxication. They planned to bring in experts to testify that 100 milligrams of THC was a toxic dose that could trigger a psychotic break in someone with Richard's specific brain chemistry. But the prosecution had a counter-expert: the evidence of Richard's own behavior. They pointed to the fact that he was able to operate the gun safe, a complex task requiring fine motor skills and memory, while allegedly not knowing who he was. They pointed to his road rage and his history of aggression. They argued that the edible didn't create the violence. It merely lowered the inhibitions of a man who had been wanting to kill his wife for months. As the trial date approached in 2015, the Denver Police Department had to face its own reckoning. The internal investigation into the 911 response concluded. The dispatcher who failed to relay the gun warning had resigned, but the damage was done. The city was facing a potential lawsuit from Chris's family. The narrative was becoming too messy for everyone involved. Richard sat in his cell, still maintaining that he loved his wife, still claiming the ginger candy was the killer. But the prosecution was about to drop a bombshell regarding Richard's religious motivations, a conflict that had been brewing in the house regarding the children's upbringing. Just weeks before the trial was set to begin, Richard's defense team received a piece of evidence from the prosecution that made them realize the insanity plea was a death sentence. They realized that if the jury saw the full history of Richard's resentment, he would never see the outside of a prison cell again. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. In a move that shocked the Denver legal community, Richard Kirk withdrew his not guilty by reason of insanity plea just 5 weeks before the trial was scheduled to start. Facing the mountain of evidence, the ammunition purchase, the diverted paychecks, the $340,000 insurance policy, and the chilling testimony of his own son, Richard and his legal team realized that the edible defense was not going to save him from a life sentence for first-degree murder. He accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The deal carried a sentencing range of 25 to 30 years. It was a compromise. For the prosecution, it guaranteed that Richard would go to prison without the risk of a distracted jury being swayed by the novel marijuana defense. For the defense, it offered a sliver of hope that Richard might one day be a free man, rather than dying behind bars. At the sentencing hearing, the performance Richard had given in the interrogation room was replaced by a somber, coached exterior. But the judge, a veteran of the bench, was not moved. He spoke about the 13 minutes Chris Kirk spent on the phone. He spoke about the children who had to watch their father descend into a monster, whether that monster was fueled by a gummy or by greed. The judge imposed the maximum sentence, 30 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, followed by 5 years of parole. The edible defense died that day, legally speaking. Because the case never went to a jury, it never set a legal precedent for marijuana-induced insanity. Richard Kirk remains in prison to this day, still insisting in occasional letters and interviews that he is an innocent man who was poisoned by a legal substance. But the facts remain. The ammunition was bought before the candy. The money was moved before the shot. The gun safe was opened with a steady hand. The true tragedy of the Kirk case isn't found in the debates over marijuana legalization. It's found in the silence of the Observatory Park home. The 3 Kirk boys were moved into the custody of their aunt. They lost their mother to a bullet and their father to a prison cell. They are the silent victims of a man who tried to use a cultural shift to mask a domestic execution. Chris Kirk's legacy isn't her death. It's the bravery she showed in those final 13 minutes. She stayed on the phone. She provided the evidence that eventually locked her killer away. She protected her children until her very last breath. The dispensary where Richard bought the candy eventually changed its name, and Colorado implemented strict, single-serving laws, requiring edibles to be stamped with a THC warning and divided into 10 milligrams increments. The Kirk case is cited in every safety meeting in the industry. As for Richard, he sits in a cell, a man who claimed he wanted to find the truth like a detective, only to be destroyed by the very truth he tried to bury under a ginger-flavored candy. The case of the edible murder was never about the edible. It was about a man who ran out of money, ran out of patience, and finally ran out of lies. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button and comment your thoughts below. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.